The mail carrier stopped halfway through his route, stared at my front yard, and said the one sentence that made every neighbor within earshot turn around. "Sir, is your mailbox a courtroom weapon?" It was a fair question. Standing at the edge of my driveway was a 7-foot judge's gavel, mounted upright like a monument to suburban judgment. The handle rose from a stone-patterned base. The giant wooden head stretched sideways above it, polished dark brown, and sealed against the weather. Built neatly into the center was a perfectly legal, regulation-height mailbox slot with brass numbers on the front. And at the bottom, on a little bronze plaque, were the words, "Final Notice." Mrs. Pemberton, the HOA president, stood on the sidewalk in a cream blazer, staring at it with the expression of a woman who had just lost an argument to furniture. "This," she whispered, "is not a mailbox." The mail carrier opened the little door, placed 3 envelopes inside, raised the red flag, and gave me a thumbs up. "Works for me," he said. I looked toward the porch camera and smiled. If you're watching Sovereign Verdict, subscribe now, because this is what happens when an HOA Karen finds a man for a crooked mailbox and accidentally gives him permission to install justice at the curb. My name is Thomas Avery, and I did not set out to build the tallest legal mailbox in Cedar Point. I just wanted my father's old mailbox to survive 1 more year. The mailbox had been there since before I bought the house, but it really became important after Dad moved in with me. He was 78, retired, stubborn, and recovering from a hip replacement he insisted was barely worth mentioning, despite needing a walker and making dramatic sound effects every time he stood up. Dad loved getting the mail. Every afternoon at exactly 2:15, he would shuffle down the front walk, check the box, complain that nobody wrote real letters anymore, and then bring inside a stack of grocery ads like he had retrieved classified documents. It became his little routine. A reason to move. A reason to get outside. A small, daily victory. The mailbox itself was old black metal on a wooden post. Nothing fancy. The post had leaned slightly to the right after a delivery truck clipped it years earlier. I had planned to fix it, but between work, Dad's appointments, and life generally throwing things at my calendar, it stayed crooked. Not falling over. Not dangerous. Just crooked. Then Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton noticed. Mrs. Pemberton was the president of the Cedar Point Homeowners Association and chair of the Streetscape Integrity Committee, which sounded like a government agency invented by people who fear individuality. She drove a silver golf cart with a tiny clipboard holder mounted near the steering wheel. Her hair never moved, even in wind. Her sunglasses were huge. Her smile had the warmth of a locked bank vault. She arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was helping Dad back up the walkway with the mail. "Mr. Avery," she called, stepping out of her cart. "Your mailbox is visibly non-compliant." Dad looked at me. "Is that a crime now?" "Apparently," I muttered. Mrs. Pemberton pointed her pen at the post. "Section 4, paragraph A, requires all curbside mail stations to be vertical, uniform, structurally sound, and aligned within 3 degrees of perpendicular." Dad leaned on his walker and squinted. "You measure mailboxes in degrees?" She looked offended. "Standards require precision." "It still gets mail," Dad said. "That is not the standard." I tried to be reasonable. "I know it leans a little. I'll straighten it this weekend." "You were issued a courtesy reminder last month." "I never received that." "It was placed in the mailbox." Dad lifted one hand. "I may have used that to write my grocery list." Mrs. Pemberton did not laugh. She removed a violation notice from her folder and handed it to me. The fine was $400, I had 5 days to repair or replace the mailbox with an approved mail station. Continued non-compliance would result in daily fines. $400 for a lien? I asked. For failure to maintain curbside uniformity. Dad looked at the notice, then at her. Lady, I survived 40 years as a courthouse bailiff. I've seen judges with less attitude than you. Her eyes narrowed. Then you should. Appreciate rules. Dad smiled faintly. I appreciate fair ones. Mrs. Pemberton ignored him and turned back to me. Replace it with an approved mail station, Mr. Avery. Something upright, dignified, and consistent with community standards. Upright, dignified, mail station. I watched her climb back into her silver golf cart and drive away. Dad waited until she was out of earshot before saying, You know what would be dignified? I already knew the answer would be terrible. What? A gavel. I looked at him. He looked at me. For the first time in weeks, his tired face lit up with real mischief. And suddenly, that crooked old mailbox did not feel like a problem anymore. It felt like evidence. I should have dismissed Dad's gavel idea immediately. A responsible adult would have said, No, Dad, we are not escalating a mailbox violation into a 7-foot monument to judicial authority. A mature homeowner would have gone to the hardware store, bought a plain black post, installed it straight, paid the fine, and moved on with his life. Fortunately, I was tired, annoyed, and raised by a courthouse bailiff with a dangerous sense of humor. So instead, I made coffee, opened the Cedar Point HOA standards, and began reading. The mailbox section was surprisingly intense. Every home had to maintain a curbside mail station, which was apparently what normal people call a mailbox. It had to sit within a specific setback from the curb, meet Postal Service access requirements, display visible numbers, and remain structurally sound. It also had to be upright, dignified, and consistent with the community's civic-inspired streetscape. Civic-inspired. That word did something to Dad. He sat across from me at the kitchen table in his robe, reading glasses on, one hand resting on his walker. Courthouses are civic. I looked up from the page. Don't start. Gavels are dignified, Dad. Judges use them. Judges also use benches. We are not building a bench mailbox. He leaned back, pleased with himself. So the gavel wins. I kept reading, hoping the rules would save me from ourselves. They did not. The standard design guide required approved mail stations to be black, bronze, dark wood, or stone-look materials. Decorative posts were allowed if they did not block delivery, exceed visibility limits for traffic, or create a safety hazard. The maximum height was 7 feet for ornamental roadside features, provided the actual mail receptacle sat between 41 and 45 inches from the road surface. I stared at that line. 7 feet. Dad saw my face change. What? He asked. I slid the paper toward him. He read the highlighted section. Then a slow grin spread across his face. Well, he said, the law has spoken. This is not law. This is an HOA document. Same costume, worse courtroom. I tried not to laugh. The next day, I called the post office. I expected them to shut the whole idea down. Instead, a supervisor named Mr. Hanley explained that the Postal Service did not care what decorative structure surrounded the box, as long as the mailbox itself met access height, distance from curb, door clearance, and safety requirements. So if the actual box is regulation height, the post around it can be decorative? I asked. As long as it doesn't endanger the carrier or block delivery, he said. Hypothetically, could it be shaped like a gavel? There was a pause. A what? A judge's gavel. Another pause. Sir, I have delivered to mailboxes shaped like fish, barns, tractors, lighthouses, and one that looked like a giant duck. If the carrier can safely reach the box, we don't care about the drama. That was all the permission I needed. I called my cousin Ray, who built custom signs for restaurants and county fairs. Ray was the kind of man who owned commercial wood sealant in bulk and once built a 12-foot fiberglass taco for a food truck grand opening. When I explained the Gavel mailbox, he listened silently. Then he said, "How angry is the HOA?" $400 angry. Then we make it classy. Over the next 3 days, Ray and I designed the most dignified act of suburban nonsense Cedar Point had ever seen. The base would look like stacked stone, wide and stable. The handle would rise vertically like a polished dark wood column. The gavel head would be hollow but reinforced, with a regulation mailbox built into the center at the correct height. The address numbers would be brass. The flag would be subtle. The plaque at the bottom was Dad's idea. Final notice. I told him it was too much. He told me courage was important. Dad supervised from a folding chair in the garage, wearing his old courthouse jacket over his pajamas because he said the project required official presence. He inspected every sketch like he was reviewing evidence. He suggested the gavel head be angled slightly forward for authority. He insisted the wood stain be dark walnut because justice should not look like patio furniture. For the first time since his surgery, he looked energized. He talked more. He laughed more. He told stories about the courthouse, about judges who forgot names, lawyers who misplaced files, and one defendant who tried to argue that a parking ticket was unconstitutional because the sign was emotionally unclear. The mailbox became less about Mrs. Pemberton. It became about giving Dad something to look forward to. On Saturday morning, we removed the crooked old mailbox. Dad stood nearby with his walker, watching as I pulled the leaning post from the ground. He went quiet. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "That old thing carried a lot of bills. And grocery ads. And birthday cards from your mother." That one hit me. Mom had been gone 8 years. Dad didn't talk about her often, but when he did, the house seemed to change shape around her memory. I set the old mailbox down gently. "We'll keep it," I said. Dad nodded once. "Put it in the garage." By noon, Ray arrived with the finished gavel in the back of his trailer. It was magnificent. Absurd, yes. Completely unreasonable, yes. But also beautifully made. Dark polished finish, brass numbers, stone look base, regulation mailbox door, hidden cleanly in the front of the gavel head. Even the red flag looked like it belonged. We installed it exactly within postal measurements. Ray checked the height. I checked the curb distance. Dad sat in his folding chair holding a tape measure like a retired judge waiting to sentence bad craftsmanship. At 2:13 p.m., the mail carrier arrived. He stopped his truck, stared, then slowly stepped out. "Sir," he said, "is your mailbox a courtroom weapon?" Dad laughed so hard he had to hold his side. The carrier tested the door, checked the reach, placed a grocery ad inside, and gave me a thumbs up. "Works for me." That was when Mrs. Pemberton's silver golf cart turned the corner. She saw the gavel from half a block away. The cart slowed, then stopped. Her sunglasses tilted upward as she stared. Dad leaned toward me and whispered, "Court is now in session." And I knew right then the hearing was only minutes away. Mrs. Pemberton did not park her golf cart. She abandoned it. The silver cart rolled to an awkward stop near the curb, one wheel half on the grass, while she stepped out slowly and stared at the 7-foot gavel like it had appeared through divine punishment. Her sunglasses slid down her nose. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "What?" she said, with perfect horror. "Is that?" Dad raised one hand from his folding chair. "Justice." I cleared my throat. "It's the replacement mail station you requested." "That is not a mail station." The mail carrier, still standing beside his truck, lifted one envelope. "Technically, ma'am, I just delivered mail to it." Mrs. Pemberton turned toward him like she had forgotten witnesses existed. "This is an HOA matter." He shrugged. "Then I'll leave you to the courtroom furniture." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, laughing before he reached the stop sign. Mrs. Pemberton marched up the driveway, her heels clicking against the concrete. "Mr. Avery, this is a deliberate act of mockery." "No," I said. "It is upright, dignified, structurally sound, and aligned within 3 degrees of perpendicular." Dad leaned over and whispered, 0 degrees. I checked. I nodded. "Actually, perfectly perpendicular." She pointed at the gavel head. "It is 7 feet tall. Allowed for ornamental roadside features. It is enormous. Not a listed violation. It says final notice. A tasteful plaque." Her eyes narrowed so tightly, I thought her sunglasses might crack. "You think this is funny?" I looked at Dad, who was trying very hard not to laugh and failing. "A little," I admitted. Mrs. Pemberton snapped open her folder. "Emergency board hearing. Tonight, 7 o'clock. The board will review this unauthorized novelty structure, and I will recommend immediate removal, daily fines, and suspension of curbside delivery privileges if necessary." Dad sat up. "Can she suspend the mail?" "No," I said. "No," she said at the same time, then looked angry that she had agreed with me. She handed me a new notice and turned sharply toward her cart. Before climbing in, she looked back at the gavel with pure disgust. "This neighborhood is not a courthouse." Dad smiled. "Then stop acting like a judge." For a second, she had no answer. Then she drove away. That evening, I walked into the Cedar Point clubhouse with my folder under one arm and Dad beside me, moving slowly with his walker but refusing to stay home. I told him he didn't need to come. He told me he had spent 40 years in courtrooms and was not missing mailbox litigation. The room was packed. Apparently, a 7-foot gavel spreads through a neighborhood faster than official announcements. Residents filled the folding chairs. Some whispered. Some smiled. One teenager in the back had clearly made a meme already. Mrs. Pemberton sat at the center of the board table wearing a charcoal blazer, pearls, and the facial expression of a prosecutor who had misplaced the law. Beside her sat 3 board members: Carol, who looked tired, Elaine, who looked curious, and Martin, who was staring at a printed photo of my mailbox with open admiration. Mrs. Pemberton banged the gavel on the table. A small, normal gavel. Dad leaned toward me and whispered, "Mine's bigger." I nearly choked. "This emergency session concerns Lot 12, Mrs. Pemberton announced, where Mr. Thomas Avery has replaced a non-compliant crooked mailbox with an unauthorized 7-foot novelty object designed to mock the authority of this association." I stepped to the podium. Dad sat in the front row, hands folded over his walker, looking more alive than he had in months. Mrs. Pemberton smiled coldly. "Mr. Avery, explain why this board should allow a giant courtroom hammer to remain at the curb." I opened my folder. "First, it is not a hammer. It is a judge's gavel." Martin murmured, "Important distinction." Mrs. Pemberton glared at him. I continued. "Second, the original violation required an upright, dignified, structurally sound mail station consistent with the community's civic-inspired streetscape. The new mail station is upright, structurally sound, and meets postal delivery requirements." I placed the postal measurements on the table. The actual mailbox slot is regulation height. The setback is correct. The carrier confirmed safe delivery this afternoon. Elaine picked up the page. "You called the post office?" "Yes." Carol looked at Mrs. Pemberton. "That seems responsible." Mrs. Pemberton's lips tightened. "The issue is not postal function. The issue is visual character." I held up the design guide. Decorative posts are allowed. Ornamental roadside features may reach 7 feet as long as the mailbox itself remains within postal height requirements and does not create a traffic hazard. Martin leaned forward. "How tall is it?" 7 feet exactly." Dad raised one finger. 6 feet, 11 3/4 inches if anyone's feeling hostile. The room laughed. Mrs. Pemberton banged her little gavel. The sound was embarrassingly small now. "Order." Then Dad slowly stood. I turned. "Dad, you don't have to." He waved me off. "I know how to address a bench." He shuffled to the podium with his walker. The room quieted. Even Mrs. Pemberton did not interrupt. "My name is Walter Avery," he said. "I was a courthouse bailiff for 40 years. That old crooked mailbox gave me a reason to walk every afternoon after surgery. It wasn't pretty. It leaned like a tired juror, but it got me moving." His voice softened. "My son didn't build that gavel to mock anyone. Not really. He built it because I made a joke, and for a few days, while we worked on it, I forgot how old I felt." The room went completely still. Mrs. Pemberton looked down at her papers. Dad tapped the podium lightly. "Rules should keep a neighborhood safe and decent. They shouldn't squeeze the joy out of a man's front yard because a post leaned a few degrees." He turned back toward me with a small smile. Then the clubhouse doors opened. The mail carrier from that afternoon stepped inside, still in uniform, holding a clipboard. Mrs. Pemberton whispered, "Oh, come on." He raised his hand. "Sorry I'm late. I'm here to confirm the mail station is deliverable." And right there, Cedar Point's most ridiculous mailbox case turned into official testimony. The mail carrier walked to the front of the clubhouse like a man who had delivered through rain, heat, dogs, sprinklers, and now apparently courtroom-themed mailbox disputes. Mrs. Pemberton stared at him with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for surprise witnesses in actual trials. Dad lowered himself back into his chair, looking deeply satisfied. I stood beside the podium, folder open, trying very hard not to smile. The carrier nodded to the board. "Name's Russell Hanley. I'm the route supervisor for this area. I inspected Mr. Avery's new mail station this afternoon after delivery." Mrs. Pemberton leaned into her microphone. "Mr. Hanley, the issue before this board is not whether mail can physically be placed inside it. The issue is whether this structure is appropriate for Cedar Point." Russell looked at the printed photo of the Gavel mailbox on the table. "Well," he said, "I can't speak to appropriate. I've delivered to a mailbox shaped like a base fish, one shaped like a tractor, and one that looked like a miniature lighthouse. People get creative when stamps are involved." The room laughed. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes flashed. Please limit your statement to postal compliance. Yes, ma'am. The mailbox door is at proper height. The setback is correct. The approach is safe. The flag works. The address numbers are clear. There is no obstruction to delivery. From our side, it is acceptable. Elaine looked at the documents. So the Postal Service has no objection? None. Martin leaned toward his microphone. Would the size of the decorative post affect delivery? No, sir, as long as the carrier can safely access the box. In this case, the large gavel is above and around the actual box. It does not interfere. Dad whispered, "The witness is credible." I looked down to hide my grin. Mrs. Pemberton tried to recover. Postal acceptance does not override HOA aesthetics. No, I said, stepping back to the podium. But HOA aesthetics do not override the actual written mailbox standards either. I held up the design guide. The rules required me to fix the lean. I did. They required an upright structure. It is. They required postal compliance. Confirmed. They allowed decorative posts and ornamental roadside features up to 7 feet. Confirmed. They required civic-inspired character. I chose a judge's gavel, one of the most recognizable civic symbols in America. Martin nodded slowly. That is technically civic. Mrs. Pemberton snapped, "It is excessive." Excessive is not a measurement, I said. That line landed hard. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Gary, who had somehow appeared in the back row despite not living on my street, whispered, "Objection sustained." The room broke. Mrs. Pemberton banged her small gavel repeatedly, but every strike just made everyone glance at the photo of my 7'1" and laugh harder. She realized it too, because after the third hit, she set it down like it had betrayed her. Carol, the tired board member, picked up the original violation. The fine was for a crooked, non-vertical mailbox. Yes, I said, and now the mailbox is vertical. Perfectly. And postal compliant. Russell nodded. Yes. And under the ornamental feature height limit. By a 1/4 inch, Dad said proudly. Carol looked at Mrs. Pemberton. Then why are we still pursuing this? Mrs. Pemberton's face hardened. Because this is mockery. If we allow this, every homeowner will turn their mailbox into a cartoon. Dad slowly raised one hand. Carol blinked. Mr. Avery? Dad leaned toward the front row microphone Gary had passed him. With respect, ma'am, joy is not the same as disorder. The room went quiet again. Dad continued, voice steady but soft. That gavel got me outside. It got my son and me working together. It gave me something to laugh about after a year of feeling like my body was turning into a list of repairs. If it was unsafe, I'd understand. If it blocked the mail, I'd understand. But it doesn't. It just makes people smile, except maybe Mrs. Pemberton. A few people chuckled gently. Mrs. Pemberton looked away. Elaine leaned into her microphone. I moved to rescind the fine against Lot 12 and approve the Gavel mail station as a compliant decorative ornamental roadside feature, subject to maintenance, postal compliance, and no additional lighting or sound effects. Dad leaned toward me. Sound effects were an option? No, I whispered. Martin raised his hand. Second. Mrs. Pemberton sat up sharply. This board cannot reward deliberate provocation. Carol sighed. Eleanor, the thing meets the rules. All in favor? Elaine asked. Elaine raised her hand. Martin raised his. Carol raised hers. 3 votes. Mrs. Pemberton's hand stayed flat on the table. "The motion passes," Elaine said. "The Gavel mailbox is approved." The room applauded. Dad closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, there was a shine there he tried to blink away. I put a hand on his shoulder. He reached up and patted it once, which was as close as courthouse men get to emotional collapse in public. 2 days later, the formal email arrived. The fine was rescinded. The mailbox was approved. The HOA records now listed it as a custom civic-themed ornamental mail station. I printed the email, framed a copy for Dad, and put the original in the folder beside the violation notice. The old crooked mailbox did not go in the trash. Dad cleaned it up, sanded the post, and mounted the little black box inside the garage near his workbench. He said retired mailboxes deserved dignity too. The Gavel became famous faster than I expected. Kids called it Judge Mail. Neighbors stopped to take photos. Even Russell the mail carrier started tapping the side twice after delivery, like he was ending court for the day. Dad loved that more than he admitted. Mrs. Pemberton still drove by sometimes in her silver golf cart. She never looked at the Gavel, but Dad always did. Every afternoon at 2:15, he took his walker down the front path, reached into the mailbox, and pulled out whatever the world had sent us that day. Bills, flyers, grocery ads, nothing important most of the time. But the walk mattered. The laugh mattered. The fact that he still had a reason to step into the sunlight mattered. And every time I saw him standing beside that giant Gavel, smiling at the absurdity of it, I remembered the real verdict. Sometimes compliance is boring. Sometimes compliance is beige. But sometimes, if you read the rules closely enough, compliance can be 7 feet tall, polished dark walnut, and shaped like justice itself. So remember this from Sovereign Verdict. Subscribe for more stories, read every line, protect the little routines that keep people going, and never let an HOA Karen fine your crooked mailbox unless she is ready for final judgment at the curb.